Good morning. It's good to see you all this morning, and good to be back after this past week's annual conference, which is wrapping up this morning with worship. So we continue to be in prayer for those who are gathered there and for their safe journeys home. This is a familiar story, probably, to many of you, the story of David and Goliath. Most likely, many who are not that familiar with Scripture would even say they know a little bit about the story, or they've at least heard the names David and Goliath. A lot of us maybe learned about it in Sunday school when we were children, or in vacation Bible school, maybe from a colorful storybook with images of young David going out to meet the giant Philistine warrior Goliath. It's a timeless story, and one that says something significant to us about our life as a faith community, seeking to live out God's will and purpose in the world. Eugene Peterson, who is best known for his translation of the Bible known as The Message, sets the scene in a way that I find helpful for entering the story and finding our place within the narrative. Peterson writes this: young David is kneeling by a brook. It's a wadi in today's translation, but young David is kneeling there by a brook, carefully selecting 5 smooth stones, feeling each one, testing it for weight and balance. David is there kneeling out in the valley of Elah, in full view of 2 armies, the Philistine army on one side and the Israelite army on the other. He's a slight figure, a mere beardless shepherd boy. And he seems vulnerable and unprotected, even unable to put on Saul's armor. And by this point, Peterson notes, the valley of Elah has become like a cauldron in which fear and hate and arrogance and power have been stirred and cooked for weeks into a lethal brew. And seemingly oblivious to the danger, ignoring the spears and the swords raised on both sides, David kneels at a brook. Now, the oddness and the improbability of David kneeling at the water's edge is made even more improbable, if that's possible, by the 2 giants on either side of the valley. On the Philistine side, there is the warrior Goliath, the physical manifestation of the threat to the future of Israel. On the Israelite side, there is a kind of a giant of his own, Saul, king of Israel, anxious and afraid, holding the future of David and the Israelite people in his hand. And in between them, Saul on the one, Goliath on the other, David kneels at a brook. Israel had, up to this point, a glorious history. Abraham and Sarah, Moses, Joshua, Samuel. Saul arrogantly believed that history was on his side. That history would save the people, guaranteed an equally glorious future. And our nation also has had some high moments in its history. And some also believe that history means an equally glorious and prosperous future. But friends, part of what this story teaches us is that history, no matter how glorious, cannot save us. Every person, every generation learns the faith anew, or they learn it not at all. We each learn to speak. We each, as a child, learn to walk. And in a similar way, we learn to trust in God and to work for God's hope and dream for the world. And as essential and as speaking and walking are, the most significant and most human thing we ever do is come to faith in God. Trust in God. God speaks His world, God reveals God's will, God chooses His people. The question then really is, who's listening? God's always doing this, revealing God's will, God's purpose, God's desire, but who's listening? Who's responding? As I've shared before, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs would ask it this way: who is ignoring the noise of now in order to hear the call of eternity? That was David. So at this particular moment in Israel's history, there weren't many listening or responding. The noise of their now was quite loud, deafening. Saul, Goliath. Coming out of a century or two of moral disintegration made worse by political chaos, Israel was at a point of losing its identity, losing touch with its history, losing hold on the theme of salvation, which provided meaning and coherence to their lives and undergirded their ability to live into their call, first given to Abraham, to be a blessing to the other nations of the world. David had been chosen to recover the health and holiness of the faith of the people of Israel. And David's importance then, and this is what really matters, lies not with his courage to fight a giant, as we so often imagine, and not even with his success with the sling. David's importance lies with the integrity of his faith. David was able to tune out the voices on either side of the valley. The voice of win at all cost violence on the one hand, the voice of nationalism, the voice of division, and the voice of fear on the other. And in so doing, listened to the voice of God. And with this as the backdrop, Peterson makes this observation. No one in that moment could have guessed that the young man kneeling by the brook, picking stones out of the water, was actually doing the most significant work of the day. It wasn't Saul, it wasn't Goliath, to whom everyone was paying attention and where they believed power resided, until David walked into the valley of Elah and knelt by the water. The only options that seemed available were a bullying giant and a fearful king. Take your choice, Goliath or Saul, violence or fear. Some might suggest that we're in a bit of a valley of Elah, toxic stew kind of moment. Our present is divided and unsettled, and the future at times uncertain. Things that once seemed impossible, well, now who knows? And it's not always in a moment like that easy to know how to be the church, how to be faithful, what's required of us to help our communities, our neighbors navigate that kind of difficult present moment, to help our nation come to a better place. But friends, David, while not perfect, offers another way, an alternative to the violence and the fear that are amassing on all sides. Kneeling calmly at the brook, David opens up another option. God's way, God's healing, God's salvation. How we so easily lose sight of this, Peterson notes. Lose our awareness that in the midst of every valley is God. But we do. We do allow the giants in our lives at times to dominate us, to garner our attention, to obscure our vision until the way of God, the way of hope, the way of peace and life becomes completely obscured, and we're left thinking violence and fear must be all that's left to save us. The story of David reminds us that in the midst of every valley runs a brook, a stream. And it contains the source of a renewed life, another option, a river called faith. And by placing our trust in God and God's way of extravagant love, we become the kind of people who overcome the giants around us and experience freedom and life. We become the kind of people and the kind of church that can move forward with confidence and with hope, trusting that God is leading us to a future that God is creating. We become the kind of people who can offer this weary world of ours a better way. So David is there choosing 5 smooth stones with which he will slay the giant and restore Israel's focus upon God. And that's the real important work that David did. Restored the people's focus on the God who created them, loves them, and called them. The question the story asks is, where are we? I want to say something just briefly about our 5 smooth stones and how they might help us move into the preferred future that God has for us. For David, they were literally 5 stones, right? He was picking out 5 smooth stones. But for us, I think they represent a different way forward, stones of faith upon which to build a foundation of grace, of a grace-filled life. They don't earn us God's favor. They're not an insurance policy against difficulty or hardship or disappointment, but they are the means by which we open our hearts and minds to the love of God and to the renewing work of the Spirit, and they enable us to live like David, to move from fear to faith. They're our way of inhabiting the world differently. They're not the only stones in the brook. You might think of others, and I encourage you to do that. But there are 5 that come to mind for me. First, in a world of real violence and linguistic violence, as Gary Mason puts it, where too often the only goal seems to be to win at all costs and defeat those on the other side, people of faith, the church, must have an unwavering commitment to speak the truth in love. And that last part is critical, to speak the truth in love, as Paul says. That means speaking, posting, sharing only those things which build up. It is so tempting to do something else from time to time, but to speak the truth in love rather than add to the noise and the division. In other words, to be people who make peace. Secondly, practicing Sabbath. I don't mean just a day of the week, but I mean regularly stopping long enough to be still and to hear the call of eternity over the noise of now, so that we can discern together God's purpose for us and the difference God is calling us to make. In other words, to be like David, to be a people of prayer and deep listening, more than a people who merely make a plan and then ask God to bless it. Third, recognizing that we were made by the love of God and for love, we're then called to love. To love others by seeing in them the image of God, the very same image that lies within us. As Thomas Merton noted, the beginning of love is to let others be perfectly themselves and not to twist them to fit our own image. Otherwise, we only love the reflection of ourselves that we see in them. So one of the ways we move from the toxicity and the division and out of our own valley of Elah and into a better place is love. Fourth, allowing Christ to be that who shapes our imagination for what's possible. Christ alone to define what it is we are to be about. Not any candidate or ideology or party or favorite news station or any other allegiance we have, as important as those allegiances might be, but allowing Christ alone to shape how we see the world and how we act in the world. And finally, we do all of this with the fifth stone, which is humility. Don't lose sight of the image of David kneeling. Jesus kneeling to wash the disciples' feet. We must approach the mission of Christ not with a spirit of self-righteous certainty, but in a spirit of humility. Devoting ourselves fully to God's mission in the world and then being content with releasing the outcome to God. We all, friends, have our own giants. We all have our own valleys. At times we may feel like David, vulnerable, unprotected, armies amassing on both sides. And it's tempting to believe that our future lies in choosing a side. But there is another way David would invite us to. Because at our feet also runs a river, a stream, faith. And it's filled with smooth stones upon which we can build a life of grace and hope and peace and joy and beauty in the midst of this world so desperately in need of another option. So may we be like David, and may we choose well. Amen.